In the summer of 1976, a 21-year-old walked into the office of his former boss and offered him one-third of a company that did not yet exist. The company was called Apple Computer. The former boss was Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari. The price was $50,000. Bushnell declined. Apple Computer, as of this recording, is worth approximately $3 trillion. One-third of $3 trillion is $1 trillion. The $50,000 investment Nolan Bushnell did not make in the summer of 1976 would today be worth something like 20 million times its original price. Bushnell has talked about this moment in interviews for almost 50 years. He has called it the single worst business decision of his life. He has said he thinks about it nearly every day. What he has never done, what almost nobody who tells this story does, is explain in detail why he said no. Because the answer to that question is not that he was stupid. It is not that he didn't believe in Steve Jobs. The reason he said no, and the larger story of what Atari was when he said it, is one of the most revealing windows into how technology history actually happens. Atari did not exist in 1970. By 1976, when Jobs walked into Bushnell's office, it was one of the most successful technology companies in California, and arguably the one most responsible for creating a new market segment, home video games, that would eventually become larger than Hollywood and music combined. Nolan Bushnell had co-founded the company in 1972 at the age of 29 with a business partner named Ted Dabney. Their first commercial product was an arcade game called Pong. Pong was simple to the point of being primitive. 2 vertical lines, a dot, a score counter. Players manipulated the lines to keep the dot in play. Nothing like it had ever been sold commercially. Bushnell and Dabney installed the first Pong machine at a bar in Sunnyvale, California. Within a week, the bar owner called them to say the machine was broken. When they arrived to fix it, they discovered the problem. The coin collector had filled up so completely that coins were jamming the mechanism. From that moment, Atari was a different kind of company. Within 3 years, Pong had spawned hundreds of imitators. Arcade video games had become a billion-dollar industry. Atari had begun developing a home console, the Atari 2600, that would, within 5 years of its release, sell approximately 30 million units. Bushnell was not a typical Silicon Valley CEO. He ran Atari with hot tub meetings in his backyard. Engineers smoked marijuana at their workbenches. Design reviews happened at beach parties. He wanted Atari to feel less like a corporation and more like a band. He succeeded. And for a time, that culture produced some of the most innovative video game hardware and software the world had ever seen. In 1974, a 19-year-old named Steve Jobs walked into Atari's lobby and refused to leave until someone gave him a job. He had just returned from a trip to India. He was barefoot. He smelled, according to multiple accounts from the period, quite strongly. He had dropped out of Reed College in Oregon. He had been auditing a calligraphy class. He had no professional experience in electronics. Atari hired him. Bushnell, in later interviews, said he gave Jobs a shot because there was something about him. The engineering manager, Al Alcorn, placed Jobs on the night shift for 2 specific reasons. The first was that Jobs' unusual hygiene made him difficult for daytime coworkers to be around. The second was that the night shift was when the engineers who needed fewer supervisors worked, and Jobs, despite his inexperience, could clearly think through technical problems in ways that suggested he did not need constant oversight. Jobs worked at Atari for most of the next 2 years. In 1976, he was given a specific assignment: design a new arcade game called Breakout and do it with the minimum possible number of integrated circuit chips. Fewer chips meant lower cost per unit. Bushnell offered Jobs a bonus for every chip he could eliminate from the design. Jobs could not design the circuits himself. He had never claimed to, but he knew someone who could. He called his friend Steve Wozniak. Stephen Wozniak was, in 1976, working as an engineer at Hewlett-Packard in Cupertino, California. He was, by any reasonable measure of the term, a genius. He had been building functional computers since he was a teenager. He had designed and built his first fully functional personal computer, something called the Apple I, in his spare time, using evenings and weekends at home. Wozniak helped Jobs design the Breakout circuit. They did it over a single weekend. The final circuit used approximately 45 fewer chips than Atari's engineers had estimated would be necessary. Jobs collected the bonus. Wozniak's share was whatever Jobs told him it was. which years later Jobs admitted had been significantly less than Wozniak thought. But something else had happened during that weekend. Wozniak had, with no specific encouragement, been building personal computers for his own amusement. He had been demonstrating them at a club in Menlo Park called the Homebrew Computer Club. Members of the club, hobbyists, engineers, a few entrepreneurs, had begun asking if they could buy the machines Wozniak was building. Jobs saw what Wozniak had. He proposed they start a company to sell the Apple I. Wozniak, who was cautious and not particularly interested in running a business, initially refused. He had a stable job at Hewlett-Packard. He had already offered the Apple I design to HP as an internal project. HP had declined to produce it. Wozniak believed that if his own employer did not see commercial value in the idea, it probably was not commercially viable. Jobs persisted. Over the course of the spring of 1976, he talked Wozniak into forming a partnership. They incorporated Apple Computer on April 1st of that year. Neither of them had meaningful capital. They needed funding. Jobs' first choice for funding was the man who had given him his first job. In the summer of 1976, Steve Jobs walked into Nolan Bushnell's office and offered him equity in Apple Computer in exchange for a cash investment. The exact terms of the offer have been discussed by Bushnell in at least a dozen different interviews over the decades. He has, in those interviews, told the story with remarkable consistency. Jobs offered him 1/3 of Apple Computer for $50,000. $50,000 in 1976 was not nothing. It was the cost of a modest house in the San Francisco Bay Area. It was more than a year's salary for most of Atari's engineers. But Atari, in the summer of 1976, was a company growing at rates that would have made $50,000 essentially inconsequential on its balance sheet. The company was preparing that same year to be acquired by Warner Communications for a reported $32 million. Atari had, in practical terms, $50,000 lying around, and Bushnell said no. The reasons Bushnell has given for his decision have shifted slightly in different interviews, but the themes are consistent, and they are worth understanding. The first reason was personal. Bushnell did not think Jobs at the time was ready to run a company. Jobs was 21 years old. He had no formal engineering credentials. He had a reputation inside Atari for being abrasive, unpredictable, and difficult to manage. Bushnell liked him, had given him the night shift job in the first place, but believed that an investment in Apple was, functionally, a bet on Jobs personally, and that was not a bet Bushnell was willing to take with company funds. The second reason was strategic. Atari in 1976 was focused on video games. It had a clear path in arcade gaming, a growing business in consumer consoles, and was negotiating the Warner acquisition that would close later that year. Nolan Bushnell had his hands full. The last thing he needed was an adjacency, a personal computer investment in a partnership with an ex-employee he was not certain was competent to deliver on it. The third reason, which Bushnell has acknowledged more candidly in recent years, was that he simply did not see the market. In 1976, the personal computer was not an obvious product category. Hobbyists were building computers in their garages. The commercial market was unproven. Even Hewlett-Packard, which had refused to produce Wozniak's design, had concluded there was no consumer market for a home computer. Bushnell agreed with that assessment. He thought the Apple would sell a few hundred units to hobbyists. He did not think it would be a business. The fourth reason, which Bushnell has never been able to fully articulate but which emerges indirectly in his accounts, is that the entire culture of Atari was hostile to the kind of slow, deliberate building that a computer company would have required. Atari was built on hits. It was built on the model of betting big on a single game, selling it as many times as possible, and moving on to the next game. A personal computer company was a different kind of business. It would have required patience Bushnell did not have, and infrastructure Atari did not know how to build, so he said no. Jobs left the office. Apple Computer eventually raised its early funding from Mike Markkula, a retired Intel executive who became the first major outside investor. Markkula's investment was structured differently from what Jobs had offered Bushnell, but the effective equity stake he received was roughly what Bushnell had been offered and declined. What happened next to both companies is almost too symmetrical to be accidental. Apple shipped the Apple II in 1977. The machine sold 6 million units over its lifetime. By 1980, Apple's initial public offering made it the largest IPO since Ford Motor Company in 1956. Jobs, Wozniak, and Markkula became instantly wealthy. Apple entered the 1980s as one of the most recognized technology brands in the world. Atari, by contrast, entered a boom that was almost intoxicating. The Atari 2600 was a runaway consumer success. The company's revenues peaked in 1982 at over $2 billion. It was, at that moment, the fastest-growing company in American history. Then came 1983. The North American video game industry collapsed. Sales of Atari products, which had peaked in December of 1982, dropped catastrophically. Consumers had lost confidence in the quality of arcade and console games after a wave of rushed and poorly made releases. Retailers were left with warehouses of unsold inventory. Warner Communications, which had paid $32 million for Atari in 1976, was now watching its acquisition lose hundreds of millions of dollars per quarter. In 1984, Warner sold the Atari consumer division to Jack Tramiel for a deferred payment of approximately $240 million, effectively nothing in cash. Nolan Bushnell had already left by then. He had departed in 1978 after disagreements with Warner's management. He started other companies, a pizza chain called Chuck E. Cheese, several video game studios, a number of consumer electronics ventures, and he was moderately successful in all of them. But nothing came close to the scale of Atari in its prime, and nothing came remotely close to the scale of what Apple had become. Nolan Bushnell has said in multiple interviews conducted between the 1980s and the 2020s that he tries not to calculate exactly how much money he left on the table in the summer of 1976. He has also said in several of those same interviews that he cannot help himself. If Bushnell had taken Jobs' offer, $50,000 for 1/3 of Apple, and held that equity through Apple's 1980 IPO and all subsequent stock splits, his stake would have been diluted over time as the company issued new shares. The exact dilution depends on assumptions about his participation in subsequent funding rounds. But even accounting for realistic dilution, a 1/3 initial stake in Apple Computer held through 2026 would be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. What is possible to say with precision is that $50,000 invested in 1/3 of Apple Computer in 1976 and held represents one of the largest missed investment opportunities in modern business history. Not the largest, probably, but among them, within the conversation. There is a version of this story that treats Bushnell as an idiot, a cautionary tale about short-sightedness, a warning about failing to see what is obviously valuable when it is in front of you. That version is wrong. Bushnell was not an idiot. He was running one of the most successful technology companies in California at the moment in question. He had accurate information about the personal computer market, information that nearly every major American technology company shared and acted on in the same way. Hewlett-Packard said no to the Apple. Digital Equipment said no to personal computers generally. IBM would eventually enter the personal computer market, but only in 1981, and only after serious internal debate about whether it was a business worth pursuing. The reason Nolan Bushnell said no to Steve Jobs in the summer of 1976 is the same reason that every dominant company in every era of technology history has said no to the thing that is about to become bigger than them. The future is never obvious, the present is always profitable. And the people who have built their careers understanding the present are structurally incapable of imagining the future on its own terms. Bushnell told Jobs no because the evidence he had pointed toward no. It was the right answer based on what he knew, and it was also catastrophically wrong. That is what technology history actually is, not a parade of smart people and dumb people. A series of decisions that were reasonable when they were made and disastrous once the future arrived to judge them. If you made it this far, you already know this channel isn't for everyone. It's for people who want the part of the story that doesn't make it into the business magazines. The meetings where the future was decided by people who didn't know that's what was happening in the room. If that's you, subscribe. The next story is about a company in Finland that, in 2004, built the iPhone in its own research lab and then killed the project in a meeting that lasted under an hour.